All right, greetings from the Dark Continent, Conscious Caracal here, or Adams Van Sale, here to shine a light on the goings-on down south, and I'm going to be speaking to a fellow South African here about a very important topic, I think, the topic of specifically nutrition and health, and we're going to try and make the waters surrounding that topic less murky than it is at the moment. And here to help me do that is a guest that I think many of my listeners already know from his prestigious work. I mean, my guest has a CV that's, if I were to read it all, that would be the topic of today's stream, and we wouldn't get to discussing anything. So I'm going to give a very quick summary from what I think will give you a good idea of who he is. So Professor Tim Noakes is a scientist, author, and emeritus professor in the Division of Exercise Science, Sports Medicine at the University of Cape Town. He is also a member of the National Research Foundation, who lists them as one of the highest rated members there. So, Professor, welcome on the show. If there's anything you want to add to that very brief introduction to your long CV, please feel welcome to do so.
Please, I'd just like to acknowledge the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, who now have given me a position because I was kicked out of my former university, which we'll come to later on. Well, not kicked out, but told that they don't want to associate with me anymore. So I have moved on a bit from then, but we'll come to that.
Yeah, we can get to that, absolutely. But maybe let's start off with the beginning. Just a little bit of a background on your journey. Where did you start off getting interested in nutrition and health, and what's the journey from there been up until now?
So I started medicine because I actually didn't know what I was going to do. And then Chris Barnard performed the first human heart transplant here in Cape Town. And that inspired me. I thought, well, maybe medicine's a good choice. So I went into medicine. And like most people, you didn't really know what you were letting yourself in for. And in my internship, where we worked in the hospital with patients, I realized that wasn't my strength. My strength was asking questions, why? I didn't like to be told, this is what you have to do because this is what we said to be important on the basis of some authority who tells you this is what it is. I was much more interested in determining why. Why was the patient sick, and how could we help the patient in ways that weren't being told to us? So I immediately finished my internship, and then I went straight into research because it was clear that was what I wanted to do. And I started in cardiac metabolism. And I was told that you must eat a high carbohydrate, low fat diet. And I believed that, and because I was working with these famous cardiologists. And then during that time, I realized that I wasn't interested just in the heart. I wanted to study the whole body. And so I went into sports science because you have to know the whole body to understand how you help athletes particularly. So I went into sports science, started sports science and sports medicine, to some extent was one of the pioneers in South Africa. And during that time, we promoted the high carbohydrate, low fat diet, and I got progressively fatter and eventually got type 2 diabetes because I have a condition called insulin resistance. And if you're insulin resistant, you eat a high carbohydrate diet, there's only one outcome in the long term. That's type 2 diabetes or cancer or dementia. My dad died of type 2 diabetes. So I realized, you've got 10 years to sort this thing out. And fortunately, I came across a book called The New Atkins for the New You, by Eric Westman and Jeff Ehrlich and Steve Finney. And 2 hours after opening it, I said, oh my gosh, I got it all wrong for 40 years. It's time to change. So I changed my diet and had spectacular results. My type 2 diabetes went into remission and I lost weight, and my exercise performance just shot through the roof, despite the fact that I was 60 at the time. And so I realized this was something that was important. We wrote a book called The Real Meal Revolution, which became a bestseller. And that caused me all sorts of trouble because now it was telling people to eat high-fat diets. And of course, their cholesterol is going to go up. They're all going to die of heart disease, and Noakes is killing them. So my university decided to let South Africa know that I was no longer a credible scientist because I was killing patients.
And this was at this point, how many years of experience had you had as a scientist when this happened?
Yeah, well, I started in science 76, and this was 2014. So that was, what's that, 24 plus 14, 38 years. And what's more, I was one of the top scientists at the university, although at the time they didn't acknowledge it. And well, perhaps they still don't, but that's the reality. When you measure things, you can measure that I'm the third most cited University of Cape Town. Sorry, I'm the second most cited University of Cape Town scientist in the recent past. But that didn't count because now I'd said something that conflicted with the funders of the university, and you must never do that. And so I had to be excommunicated. And so it got so bad that I eventually had to go to court against the Health Professions Council because they said I was acting unprofessionally and so on. So we went to court for 28 days over 4 years, and we won 13-0. It was a big final, and we completely destroyed them. And then I realized that these people have no interest in science, absolutely nothing. So we presented 7,000 pages of science to support my position, and the opposition came with one paper of it was of 30 pages. I mean, it's 30 pages, that's a lot. So it was one paper which we continue to think it's fraudulent, but we complained about it, and they had to change some of the things, but they didn't actually go to the full extent we think that where they manipulated the findings to support themselves. But even then, that paper did not prove that the low carbohydrate diet that I prescribe is dangerous or is less effective than a high carbohydrate diet. There was no evidence for that. Yet the South African media took this paper and said, you see, Noakes is wrong and he's killing patients. But the paper didn't say that. It never supported that. And now, I've gone back to those journalists and I've said, this is what you said in 2014 and we've disproved it. And we went to court. Now, aren't you going to retract that? No, that was the truth 10 years ago and we've moved on.
But Professor, I think something many of my audience will be able to relate to is how the health sciences seem to just shift with the wind. One year, eggs are the key to health. The other year, eggs are the devil. You shouldn't even eat one. The next year, carbohydrates are the new thing that's going to keep you healthy. The next year, it's not. Can you give us some insights? What's going on here? Why can't people just find certainty with what to eat? People are so confused. People at the moment just can't find out what the truth is because you just have conflicting reports everywhere, and what's true this year next year will not be true anymore. What's going on here?
Well, the problem is nutritional sciences is not a science. That's the bottom line, and you have to understand that. Now, the most cited scientist in the world is a guy called Walter Willett at Harvard. Now, Walter developed the nutritional sciences. And the studies that he does, and he's been doing for 40 years or so, is they take a population. Let's say it's a population of doctors or people in the area. They take a lot of people, 1,000 people, and they follow them for 30 years. And at the end of 30 years, they said, well, you see, these guys had died of a heart attack. So what were they eating? Oh, these people were eating more fat and less grains. So therefore, it's more fat that killed them. But that's what we call associational studies. Now, associational studies can only prove causation if there's a very strong relationship. For example, there was one of the most famous associational studies that proved causation was cigarette smoking. So heavy cigarette smokers were at a 10-fold increased risk of getting lung cancer compared to non-smokers. So in other words, if you took 1,000 people who were smokers and 1,000 people with non-smokers, then the smokers had 10 times as many cases of lung cancer. Now, that clearly is causal. That you couldn't explain that any other way. Walter Willett changed the rulings. And so the people who did that research, a guy called Bradford Hill, he said, only if it is 2 to 5 times higher, the incidence of the condition in the people who are doing what you think's wrong. So only if the people who are eating meat have a 2 to 5-fold increased risk of whatever you think's bad, only then can you say, maybe it's causal. And then what you do is you go and do a study and you give people to eat meat. You make them eat meat their whole lives. And you take 50,000 of them and they're not allowed to eat meat, and 50,000 must eat meat. And after 40 years, you look for the rates of heart disease, cancer in those two populations. Now, because that can't be done, Walter Willett said, no, we don't need to do that. We'll just follow these people and retrospectively decide what they ate and what caused the problem. But what Walter Willett did was he ignored what Bradford Hill had said. And Bradford Hill said, only if the incidence of the condition is 2 to 5 times greater in the population who are doing the bad thing, can you begin to suggest there might be a causal relationship? Walter Willett said, no. If it's 1.01 times higher, 1.01 times higher in the population, that means it's causal. And that's the problem. So they've dropped the bar for causality to 0. So basically, you can prove in nutritional research that anything causes anything. And John Ioannidis, who is one of the greatest scientists currently alive, has looked at this, and he said we have to reform nutrition sciences. So then let's put it in perspective. You asked the question, why do we change the dietary advice every week? Because Walter Willett publishes a new paper, and because he's from Harvard, he publishes it in the New England Journal of Medicine. And because it's published in the New England Journal of Medicine, the New York Times has a link to that. So Walter Willett communicates with the world through the New York Times. And he is essentially vegetarian and biased towards cereals and grains, and biased towards processed foods as being healthy. And so he can easily go back to his data and look for 1,000 relationships and find these things, that particularly if you eat cereals and grains, then you're going to be healthy. The problem is, what it really shows is that 30 years ago, people were told, you eat cereals and grains. So the marathon runners and the people who are lifting weights and being healthy and not smoking were all eating cereals and grains. So the cereals and grains is a marker of a healthy person. They're not the cause of the healthy person. And that's the problem. We've not got beyond that. So, I mean, this week, finally, eggs found to be healthy. Well, we've known that for a long time. Yeah. So all of a sudden, we've gone from eggs must be avoided, 1 egg a week, to now you can eat as many eggs as you like, because they got it right, finally, that they actually, the association that can be associated, that is causal. We know that eggs are healthy because they're full of nutrients that you need.
Well, on that topic, seeing as that is one of the cliches to go to, is eggs have always been one of the roller coaster foods that people just nutritional scientists are debating constantly about, but you seem to have a very strong stance there. What are some of the other big lies and myths that millions of people still believe about nutrition and still are poisoning their bodies with even to this day?
Well, I think the one is that saturated fat is dangerous for you and it'll kill you, and fat will make you fat, and that's nonsense. I think, to simplify the nutritional message is extremely simple. There are 2 metabolic states in which the humans can exist. And the one is with lots of insulin circulating, that's the high insulin state. And the other one is the low insulin state. And to get to the low insulin state, you have to remove most carbohydrates and sugar and most processed foods because they're full of sugar. And the evidence is absolutely clear, if you want to see it, that the low insulin state is the healthy one. That's what you want to be in. And those are the states which are related to low blood pressures, low obesity, low visceral fat. It's visceral fat that's the killer. It's the beer book that we talk about. That's what kills you. And you don't want that. And what causes that is high carbohydrate diets causing high insulin. It's not the meat that's causing that. It's the beer and the chips that you have with the meat that are causing the problem, when the sugar and the sweets that you have after you've eaten your piece of meat. That's the problem. So that's the high insulin state. Sorry, the low insulin state is the healthy one. The high insulin state's a disaster. And what's happened is we've moved, because 4 million years ago, humans evolved in a low insulin state where we burnt fat. We ate fat animals and meat, and we
didn't have bread.
We didn't have bread and pasta and rice and potatoes and bananas and fruit, and we didn't even have vegetables until about 10,000 years ago. So we were in a low insulin state. Now that has changed, particularly since sugar comes into the diet, then the processed foods comes into the diet more recently. The grains came in about 18,000 years ago, but then sugar comes in about 1800 to 1900. That's when sugar starts to take off. And then more recently, it's the processed foods and the high fructose corn syrup and vegetable oils. That's the killers today.
Mm.
So I like to simplify it. You either live with a high insulin or you live with a low insulin. And I can tell you that if you live with high insulin, all sorts of medical complications are awaiting you in the future. You may be fine now. You may get a great lift from the sugar addiction, that eating this diet gives you a lift and makes you feel great, but that's the addiction. And it's a drug, and that's food for entertainment. That's not food for nutrition. When you eat food for nutrition, you get into low insulin state, and then your body's healthy and you can live a lot longer.
Mm. Now that you talk about sugar addiction, I see here Cameron Heslop says in the chat, he's listening now live. He says it's such a challenge to cut sugar out of your diet. Now, Professor, do you have any advice for this listener that seems to be struggling with cutting sugar out of their diet?
Thanks, Cameron. I think the first point to realize is what you have done is that sugar is an addiction, and it's like all addictions. You have to remove it completely. You can't moderate it. The advice, the dietary advice that you can eat in moderation, you can eat poisons in moderation or addictive substances in moderation is complete nonsense. You can't. So it's like the person who has a problem with alcohol or cigarettes or sex or whatever. You've got to take it out of your life and you've got to completely avoid it. And that's the problem. It's very difficult. It took me 14 months to get rid of sugar from my tea. I could cut the processed food quite quickly because I love biltong and I love meat. So that was never a problem. But cutting the sugar, because I was so addicted to it. And of course, we had the sugary drinks when we used to run our marathons and eat these sugary things. And you finish the marathon, and what's the first thing you grab? Is a cola drink, and that gives you a fantastic boost. But that's all the addiction. And then, of course, you get the down thereafter. So, Cameron, you really need to work on it and cut it out. And unfortunately, got right here. The lady who is one of the world authorities on sugar addiction is Joan Ifland. And she has one of the books that she's written, Sugar and Flowers, How They Make Us Crazy, Sick, and Fat, and What to Do About It. And she talks about sugar addiction. And she has another book about, which is more of a medical book, which I don't have quite here, but on sugar addiction. So there's a lot of evidence on sugar addiction, but you have to read it and realize that, okay, I'm going to have to work on this one. But in the end, you'll be so much healthier if you can get rid of sugar out of your diet.
So these two aren't questions, they're just feedback. I see Cameron does say, he says, I was drinking 4 teaspoons of sugar in my coffee. I now don't drink any sugar. It took me 4 years to cut it out. Well, congratulations. But yeah, I also went down from 3 to 1, but that last 1 is the last hurdle that I need to get over.
So what you have to do is go to half and quarter. And once you reach quarter, you'll realize, actually, I don't need it anymore. And
the thing is, now I find 3 teaspoons of sugar in coffee unpalatable after I've cut it down to 1.
Absolutely. And as you get down to 0, it'll be even more unpalatable. So it's actually very easy. Once you get down to 1, you're almost there. And because your taste completely changes. And then, as you said, it becomes horrible. I remember I was at the airport somewhere in Canada many years ago, and I ordered a coffee, and they added sugar, and I spat it out. As I drank it, spat it out. It was so terrible.
Your body just rejected it. I see Zulu Warrior Princess also says, I lost 25 kilograms after I learned healthier ways to cook. I found that the more meat I eat, the less I desire to have sugary and processed foods. I have so much more energy now and have more endurance. Well, that seems pretty much in line with what you are saying, Professor.
Yeah, thanks, Princess, for saying that, because that is the truth. And, all the people who are low-carb promoters like myself, medical doctors and so on, and dietitians, we're the ones who had a problem, and we solved it by doing exactly what you'd done, Princess. We found the truth. The problem is that our profession is full of people who have never done that. And so we run a course for low-carb teaching, and I've just come off a web discussion. And I spoke to one of the students we trained from North America, and who analyzed all the data he'd collected over 10 years about patients, putting them on low-carb diets, exercising them, and fantastic results, just as Princess said, all amazing results.
Mm.
And so I told them that I was introduced to this low-fat diet in 1970 by a chap called Jim Mann. And Jim Mann wrote an editorial actually a few years ago in the Lancet in which he said the low-carb diet's a complete disaster, you see. And I said to Peter, who'd done this research and is publishing a paper on it, what's the difference between you and Dr. Mann? And there are two things. Firstly, Dr. Mann's the professor, and he's never treated a patient with a low-carb diet. And in fact, he's never treated one patient with diet, not one. Yet he's the expert. When the Lancet wants an article, they go to him. But he has no practical experience whatsoever. Here's Peter, who has no university training, but has been working with patients for 30 years and has seen the results. And who would you listen to? Would you listen to a guy who's never treated a patient with a diet? Or would you listen to someone who's made his life business that treating the patients? And I think that's the point, that the reason why we're so confident that we're right is because we've seen it in ourselves. And then we see all the other people who we've helped on this diet. So the truth will ultimately come out. But for Princess, she discovered it. But this is no criticism of Princess. Why did she have to discover it? Why hadn't she been told it in her school? She should have been told, this is the one diet. This is the high insulin diet. This is the low insulin diet. If you are insulin resistant, you have to eat the low insulin diet or you're going to get fat and unhealthy.
So just for clarification, Professor, just to make sure everyone understands, the low insulin diet is the low carb diet.
That's correct, yeah. Because carbohydrates require insulin to get rid of the carbohydrates and store them in your liver and your muscles. The problem is that the insulin then prevents you from burning fat, and that humans are designed to burn fat. That's how we evolved. We evolved by eating elephants, big fat elephants. You know, people think, oh, these poor humans 4 million years ago, or because we weren't humans then, we were something else. How could they possibly have killed elephants? Well, they did. That's the reality, and that's what they lived off. And right through till about 400,000 years ago in Europe, that was the main source of energy, was elephants. And then they killed off all the elephants. So then they had to find something to replace it. And that's where the grains came in, because they'd run out of big animals. Humans killed off all the big animals, and we needed big animals because big animals carry lots of fat on them. And that's what we needed. We didn't need so much protein. We needed lots of protein, but we needed even more fat. And we only got it from these big animals. And then we were so successful, and humans selected the most athletic animals, the fittest animals. We didn't look for like lions and go and find the buffalo that's weak. Humans went for the strongest animals because we were such good killers. And unfortunately, we were such good killers that we killed out all this, what we call the megafauna, the very big animals on all the continents. And only Africa was left with the animals.
Before we continue, I just want to read two comments that I think you'd like to hear. Sideliner Opinion says, sorry, I can't listen. I'm at work. We'll listen later. Great guest, one of my moral mentors. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Sideliner, for sending that. And then also there was one more comment that I wanted to read. This one, Dalian Hogan says, I love Dr. Noakes, a true health warrior. Now, Professor, something else that I wanted to know is we've been talking about some myths and things, but is there any other foods or diets that are currently being sold as a food hero, or like a real superfood, and it's all just fake and it's actually harming people? Is there anything like that currently, if you ask someone on the street, they're going to say, of course, this is a super healthy food or a super healthy diet and everyone should be eating this, but it's actually not based on science?
Yeah, that's interesting. Let me just make the point that there is a scam going around on Facebook, which says that Dr. Noakes says this is the diet you need to follow. So please, if you've seen that scam, don't follow it. It's been 3 years and we try to stop it. And the people are so clever. They just steal your money and you never hear from them again. So no, I don't know of any diet that's currently being promoted. I think that the word diet is the problem. You know, it's an eating pattern and you need to eat real foods. That's the key. Once you get to eat real foods that come from the farm, that's what we want to eat. We want to support the farmers. not the processed food manufacturers. That's where the problem arises. So we appeal to people to buy your foods directly from the farmers if you can. And those are the real foods that are full of nutrients. Animal produce is full of nutrients. This processed rubbish, they take all the nutrients out, and then it just becomes a disaster.
And and I think something that relates to that is definitely your mortal enemy, the food pyramid. I mean, that's something we all were taught in school. I remember specifically having a poster of that in my classroom, and in every classroom when I was in primary school. But yeah, what are some of your thoughts? I think the audience and I already know what some of your thoughts are there, but maybe elaborate specifically on that piece of propaganda, because I remember specifically that being in every classroom and being pushed by everyone for so long, and still today.
Yeah, well, that comes in 1977. That's the dietary guidelines. The American dietary guidelines come out in 1977, and they produce this pyramid in which they put cereals and grains at the bottom and meat and animal produce at the top, when you're only allowed little bits of it. And you're told to cut down on saturated fat, cut down on fat. And that was a disaster. What happened? Within 2 years, the American obesity epidemic starts. And 20 years later, the diabetes epidemic starts, because it takes 20 years of that diet to cause diabetes. And there was never any evidence whatsoever for it, except for the nutritional sciences research, which is completely wrong. So that there was no clinical trials of that diet to say, we have studied people over 20 years eating this diet, and we show that they're much healthier than people eating the traditional meat and dairy and so on. Those studies were never done. It was just because the reason was political, really. What happened in 1972 was Nixon was running for president, and he had two problems: that the cost of food had just shot up, and the farmers were unhappy because they weren't getting paid enough. And he appointed a new Secretary of Agriculture who solved the problem. He said, it's easy. We just make all farms together. We join them up in the Midwest, and they all start just growing corn and wheat. And we will make those the major products that humans will eat. And they were incredibly successful. They had such an excess of grains produced that to sell them to Russia. Russia had a problem that year. They'd run out of grains. So they had a big market. So that was the problem. And there was no evidence whatsoever that the grains were going to make people healthier. They were just cheaper. And so the farmers made more money and the cost of food came down. It was never designed to make us healthy. And unfortunately, what happened is then industry got involved, because they were now making lots of money. And they controlled the dietary guidelines ever since. And they made sure that their people were always promoted by the people drawing up these guidelines. So if you were a scientist who they wanted to influence, they would fund you to do research on grains. And then when they come to draw up the guidelines, that you would be on the committee to draw up the guidelines. And the most recent guidelines, exactly the same happened. I think of the 12 people or so who drew up the guidelines, 9 of them are directly linked to big food. So there's no independence there.
And on that topic, you just gave us the historical background, but let's get to the present, and we can definitely see that the in vogue public enemy number one is definitely red meat, and there's a big push to completely smear red meat as this big cause of all that's wrong in the world. Firstly, why has red meat now been targeted in this way? And then secondly, why is that completely wrong?
Okay, red meat's being targeted by the globalists, and one has to understand that we're in the Third World War at the moment, and the globalists are a group run by the World Economic Forum by a guy called Schwab. He's the main man. They've never been elected. They've just appointed themselves, and they just had their meeting in Davos. 1,400 private planes flew into Davos, and these are the people who flew in and said, you see, you mustn't fly in an airplane because that's causing global warming, and you can't eat meat. But when you have pictures of what they were eating, it was meat and fish and all the beautiful foods. So these people are complete hypocrites, and they're fascists, and they want the world to be controlled by 3,000 people globally, including all the high-tech people from Facebook and Twitter and so on. And that's what we're fighting against. Now, one of their complaints is that they want to destroy agriculture and have it taken over by Bill Gates because he's producing fake meat. And so that he's currently the largest landowner in North America is Bill Gates. And why did he buy the land? To put cattle on it? No. He's going to put soy on it. And that's going to be produced into fake meat and so on and so forth. So that's the problem. So then how do they get rid of meat? Oh, they say meat causes climate change, and climate change is causing this, and climate change is causing the pandemic. That's what Prince Charles said a few weeks ago. Part of the pandemic problem is global warming. Hold it. How does that link, Charles? Where were you trained at Eton? Did they teach you that there or what? So you have to understand that it's part of the globalists wanting to control the world, and so they want to get rid of meat production, and they also want people to be weak and fat and lazy and not taking care of themselves. That's part of this whole model, this whole COVID story, is that you can't, you're going to get sick because this virus is going to kill you, and there's nothing you can do about it but take a vaccine. Whereas the reality is you've got to make yourself healthy and look after yourself. And we're forgetting that. Fortunately, I was born in an era where before the vaccines came along and we weren't vaccinated to death. And we were taught you must be healthy, you must eat properly and look after yourself, and then you'll be healthy and have a good immune system.
Well, that actually relates to something that my father always mentions, is the fact that in his when he was growing up, the doctors used to prescribe lifestyle changes when they had a problem or when they were sick. But today you're just prescribed a pill or a medicine. That seems to be the way to go.
Yeah, so that's the theory between the germ theory and the terrain theory. And this goes back right to the 1880s when Pasteur was around and described the first bacteria, and he became the great guy saying there's one germ for each disease. So then we would produce a medical drug that will kill that germ. And against him were the terrain theorists who said, no, it's the terrain, it's the environment that you live in, where there's pollution and poor nutrition and so on, and stress and poisons and so on. That's what's causing problems. And that battle continues. And unfortunately, the globalists are winning, and they're winning on the germ theory. So no one, if you follow the advice you got for preventing COVID-19, there's not one person who came out and said, look to the terrain to fix yourself up. That's the problem. And they've said it's a germ, we've got to treat the germ. No one spoke about the terrain. And the reality is...
Excuse me, Professor, can you maybe first just elaborate on that terrain theory? What aspects of the terrain are impacting people's health?
Okay, so the terrain is your body plus the environment that you're in. So a lot of people think that there's a lot of poisons in the environment, and there's electricity has got something to do with it, and 5G has got something to do with it. And those are areas I'm not an expert in, but that's the sort of things they look for. It's interesting, if you go back far enough, before germs were described, they used to talk about a miasma, that was the environment. And but you need to go back to London in the 1820s and to Manchester in the 1800s. Those cities were terrible. They were polluted, and the nutrition was appalling, and smallpox was rife, and measles was rife. So you had poor people who were poorly nourished, and they were living in the most dreadful conditions which we could not imagine how bad they were. And when the germ got into those communities, they went through everyone very quickly. But when we cleaned up those environments, then people were healthier and they could cope better with infectious diseases. So the terrain is everything around you and your own body that could make you sicker. And it's mainly, people talk about poisons in the environment, which we underestimate. No one talks about them. The amount of agricultural poisons or pesticides that are being used, and what happens when they get into our bodies. What about plastic pollution? Those sorts of things which we don't consider. It's just a germ. It's a COVID-19.
I can talk from experience, Professor, growing up in an agricultural community, surrounded by farms where they were spraying pesticides. Everyone in that town where I grew up disproportionately had sinus problems and constant sinus infections and all other types of ills regarding their respiratory tracts. And there has to be a connection.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that's the terrain theory. And my message to everyone is that, you look after your own immune system and keep it healthy. And you can't do that if you're in a high insulin state. Got to get into low insulin and eat nutrient-dense foods. Food is not entertainment. Food is nutrition. And when you eat stuff, put it in your mouth, make sure it's giving you the most nutrition, the most nutrients that it's possible to get.
My next question, I'm just going to close a curtain here because there's a very bright light coming in, but you can answer the question so long. Is on that topic of, we've talked about what's behind the agenda against red meat, but why is that completely false? Why is red meat actually a very positive part of people's diets, and why should they not be rejecting it and cutting it out of their diets?
You see, this is the other problem, that people don't know history. They don't understand what went before. They don't understand that what made human is when we went off eating shoots and roots as we were as chimpanzees. Chimpanzees was our lowest common evolutionary ancestor. And the chimpanzee's metabolism is totally different to humans, and its intestine is completely different. So if you want to live on roots and shoots, you have to have an enormous large intestine where the shoots come in there in the cellulose, because humans can't digest cellulose. Neither can chimpanzees digest cellulose. The cellulose is digested by a bacteria in the large bowel, which breaks it down to saturated fat. So the gorilla who's sitting there eating 18 hours a day, eating 40 pounds of leaves, and is converting that into saturated fat, but he has to spend 18 hours a day doing that. Humans, or early humans, Australopithecus or whatever, the earliest humans, Homo habilis, one of them realized, why should we spend 18 hours a day converting this stuff, these plants, into saturated fat, when there are animals called antelope who are designed to do it? The antelope is designed to convert the grass, which has no nutrient value whatsoever, into saturated fat and protein. Why don't we just kill those animals and eat the protein and the saturated fat, and we'll be healthy? And as soon as they started doing that, the gut completely changed. We have a totally different gut than these other animals that we've spoken about, the primates. So we changed the gut and we developed this brain, because this brain needs a lot of energy. And you only get that energy easily from animal produce. You can get this energy if you need to from fruits and stuff, but you got to eat a lot of it. And unfortunately, you get so much of the carbohydrate that has the insulin impact.
Professor, there's a question here for you from B Smart. He asks, what about the relation between wheat and anxiety? That's a very interesting question. I don't know, Professor, if you have anything to enlighten us on there. I'm completely unaware about that connection.
Yeah. Well, B Smart, I think you should read Wheat Belly by Dr. Davis. And he describes what happens when you remove wheat from the diet. He was one of the very first doctors who started talking about wheat being a problem. And I haven't eaten wheat for 12 years now. So I've kind of moved away from that area of research. But I think that you'll find what we're discovering, and in fact, there's a paper out very recently, that the low insulin state is an anti-anxiety state. So it may not be the wheat, but it's what else you're eating with the wheat. It's the high carbohydrates that are driving your insulin. And that may well be promoting anxiety. So what I can promise you is once you cut the wheat, you're going to a low insulin state. And that's what you want to be in. And if you are anxious, your anxiety is going to be improved. But whether it's the wheat or not, I don't know. Maybe it is. By the way, wheat has addictive components as well. And so that's why a lot of people can't cut bread very easily.
Yeah, I mean, that's I can attest to the fact that a nice piece of bread with some with just some toppings on it is definitely a very addictive thing. A little bit of cheese or anything, but the cheese on its own seems to be quite fine according to your diet.
Absolutely.
Professor.
There's no studies ever even in these associational studies, which don't prove causation, they've never been able to find a negative outcome for dairy produce. Dairy produce has always been positive. So, which is really interesting.
Yeah, so that's your real butter, that's your milk, that's your cheese. All right.
Yes, and in converse, if you're eating vegetable oils, they are highly toxic. Vegetable oils, I think the simplest explanation for the audience, we've talked about the low insulin, high insulin state, but there's another state. Your cells are mammalian cells. They're not we're not plants, we're mammals. So isn't it likely that the mammalian tissue that you eat is much more likely to be more compatible with your body than vegetables and plants, which are totally different? And that to me makes obvious sense. We have a commonality with all these mammals, and their cells are very similar to ours. So why don't you eat their cells? Because that will replace what your cells need. But when you're taking plants, the plant is different. It's not the same as your cells.
And then while you're on that topic, Professor, your thoughts on, for example, eating things like liver, kidney, these types of organs. Is there a big health benefit, not just eating muscle, but also eating organs?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. You have to do that to be absolutely perfectly healthy. And liver is the most nutrient-dense food that you can get. And so a little liver frequently once a week or so is excellent, and kidneys as well, and hearts and brains. So all those offal, so-called offal, which people don't eat because, oh no, that's cheap.
Well, I come from a Afrikaner community and culture, so we don't really look down on eating offal or intestines, so it's not a problem for me.
So have you ever wondered why all the big locks in South Africa are Afrikaners?
Well, they're eating a lot of red meat. Well, that's, if you look at, for example, compare Europeans to South Africans and how tall we are and how small they are. I mean, we're eating meat every weekend, and we're eating it just as it is, unprocessed, a piece of cut meat from the animal itself.
Exactly right. And so I was just watching the Lions series, and the Lions said, oh my gosh, these South Africans are so big.
No, it's absolutely connected to the diet. I mean, I don't think you need to have a degree to really see that. I think that's something that's common knowledge. But Professor, on that note of meat, and you were talking about, you were describing your diet, but when you look at what's being prescribed for a problem like cholesterol, then the common or mainstream medical science would say your diet is exactly the opposite of what someone with cholesterol problems would need to eat. And I know that's a topic that you've have a lot to say and have written a lot about. Could you maybe elaborate a bit and enlighten us on the issue of cholesterol and how it relates to your views on diet?
So I've just finished an article. I was asked to write this by Eric Westman, who wrote the book that saved my life. And he said, Tim, I watched a video you did in it was actually in Sydney. You were talking about studying causation. How do you prove that something causes something? And he said, you really nailed it. And what I was looking at was cholesterol. Does cholesterol cause heart disease? Now, what you have to understand, in science, there are so-called, in medical practice, there are certain foundation myths. And I made a career of tackling those foundation myths in the sciences, in sports science. So the one foundation myth was that when you exercise, your muscles run out of oxygen, they become anaerobic, and you produce lactic acid, and the lactic acid poisons your muscles. And I showed one graph. There's one picture. All you have to see this picture, and you know that that's false. One picture, and we know it's false. So anyway, then I developed the model which says that the brain regulates performance, because you don't want to harm yourself. The body's not stupid. It's not going to allow you to run so hard in the heat that you die, or you go to such a high altitude that you die. The brain will say, no, you must stop, and it will force you to get all these terrible sensations of fatigue, which is just an emotion. Fatigue is an emotion, and you respond to that emotion by stopping. And that's what that model is. So I looked at what there's two foundation myths in cardiology, which I was introduced to in the 1960s, 70s. And every single cardiologist in this country believes them implicitly. and they are taught as gospel in every medical school in South Africa and the rest of the world, but they are foundation myths. And the one is that so-called diet heart hypothesis, that if you eat a diet high in saturated fat, you will die of heart disease. Never proven. The other one is that if you eat a diet high in fat, it causes the cholesterol to rise, and the cholesterol causes harm. Never proven at all that cholesterol causes arterial damage. And the absolute proof for this, the absolute proof is the statin, the cholesterol lowering drugs. So everyone is told, if you've got high cholesterol, you must take statin therapy because it's going to lower your cholesterol, and then we know that you're never going to have a heart attack. And that is not true. In medicine, if you want to prove causation, you have to remove what you think is the cause, and the disease must disappear. It can't just get less. It must disappear. So now we've had these cholesterol-lowering drugs for about 25 years. And the benefits that they show is probably 1 in 100 people might get a small little bit of benefit, 1 in 100, which means that the other 99 don't get any benefit. They're still at risk of having another heart attack, even though they're taking statin drugs. Therefore, they have not proven causation, because they've lowered your cholesterol to the normal level and you still had a heart attack. Therefore, cholesterol is not the cause. And I debated a guy called Professor Libby in Cape Town many years ago. He's professor of cardiology at Harvard Medical School, the most elite medical school in the world. He published a paper in 2005, and he asked the question, why is it that in studies with statin therapy, that 60% of the heart attacks occur in people taking the statin? What? 60% of the heart attacks occur in people who are taking the drug? Then the drug's not working. It's hopeless. Therefore, cholesterol is not the cause. So he provided the evidence. But do you think he will stop advising patients to use statins? No, unfortunately not. So I could go to court tomorrow. And well, in fact, I did, because part of the trial was on cholesterol and heart disease, and I'm going to kill patients. We showed the evidence. There's no evidence. It's a foundation myth. And unfortunately, foundation myths are never questioned because everyone accepts them as the truth. So it's like the pyramid. You know, everyone knows the pyramid makes you healthy because you were taught it from grade 1 to grade 10, grade 12. You were taught the pyramid works. From grade 1 to grade 12, you were taught cholesterol causes heart disease. It doesn't. There is no evidence. But I can tell you this because I'm not a cardiologist whose life is dependent on me prescribing statins.
So when it comes to heart disease, from your research, what is the main cause behind it?
Okay, fabulous. Remember we spoke about the hazard ratio that would prove causation, and we said it has to be between 2 to 5. So that if you have 5 times as many people dying from this condition and you think it's this cause, then you probably proved the cause. If you have type 2 diabetes, your risk of having a heart attack is 10-fold greater. The hazard ratio is 10. It's not 2, it's not 5, it's 10. There's no question about causation. That is the cause. So type 2 diabetes is the biggest cause of heart disease in this country and every country. The problem is we don't diagnose type 2 diabetes accurately. There's a preclinical stage where people have type 2 diabetes. They have all the damaging effects in their bodies, but the tests don't detect it. So if we were to do proper testing, we would then be able to detect even more people who are at risk. But it's type 2 diabetes. But now I'm going to really surprise you, because I didn't know this until a year ago. And here I am, expert on heart disease. The worst arterial disease occurs in people with sickle cell disease, which is a common condition in West Africa because it gives you some immunity to malaria. And these people are born with genetically different red blood cells, which are very rigid. They sickles, instead of being nice and round and fluffy, and they can get bent into shape when they travel through arteries. These sickle cells are rigid and they can't be bent. And they scrape the arterial lining, and they scrape off the arterial lining. And then the arterial lining gets replaced with a blood clot and then heals. and they have the worst arterial disease. So the arterial disease is caused by damage, scraping damage to the arterial lining. And that's worsened in people with diabetes because the diabetic cell is the same. But insulin and glucose, which are high in people with diabetes, also damage the lining of the arteries. So heart disease is caused directly by damage to the arterial lining. It's not the old theory that cholesterol forces its way in. There is no way that cholesterol can force its way in. There's no metabolic pathway for that to happen. But if it gets scraped and damaged, then it turns out that then you form a clot. And the clot looks like it was formed by cholesterol, but it wasn't. It was caused by the red blood cells clotting. So that's the reality. Our understanding of heart disease is completely wrong. It's caused by factors that are unrelated to the blood cholesterol concentration. And apart from sickle cell anemia, there are other inflammatory diseases that cause widespread arterial disease. But for that common person who doesn't have sickle cell anemia, doesn't have inflammatory diseases, it's type 2 diabetes all the way.
And that is directly related to a diet that's not correct.
That's correct. And so I'm a classic to type 2 diabetes in remission. My dad dies of the disease. I go back and look at data that I'd collected on myself in experiments when I was 28, and I was profoundly insulin resistant. So what we did in the 1978, it was, we studied ourselves because we wanted to look at ketosis, and ketosis wasn't of much interest at that time. But we were able to show that if you don't eat carbohydrates, your ketosis goes very high. And if you exercise, it goes even higher. So, but we tested ourselves. So we had ourselves eating high carbohydrate diets and low carbohydrate diets. And on a high carbohydrate diet, my fasting insulin, and this is the way you detect whether you're insulin resistant. My fasting insulin was 30, which is 6 times normal. 6 times normal. I'm running marathons. I'm absolutely lean, incredibly fit. And I have an insulin that is 6 times normal. And when I ate a low carbohydrate diet, it came down to 2 times normal, but it's still too high. And so I was a walking time bomb. I had to get type 2 diabetes. And worse, I was eating this high carbohydrate diet, and that just triggers it. So the insulin resistance has to be there, probably on a genetic basis, and then you eat this high carbohydrate diet, and ultimately you're going to get the type 2 diabetes. You can exercise a lot. It'll delay it for a couple of years, but you're still going to get there ultimately.
And then, Professor, I wanted to know, seeing as you're talking about fitness and you running marathons, can you give us some thoughts on the relationship between diet and fitness? How closely are these two? I know there's definitely a strong relation, but maybe a little bit of elaboration on how closely these two are elaborated. Fitness, how your endurance, your cardio health, all that is related to, for example, doing sport and keeping fit.
Yeah, so sport's absolutely critical, but if you're eating the wrong diet, you might as well not do it. You're wasting your time. I think that's the key, and the people need to understand that. The first thing is get your diet right. And if you are insulin resistant, you must eat a low carbohydrate diet, and then the exercise will be very beneficial. When I started marathon running in 1970, 72 was the first marathon I ran. The last finisher finished in 3 hours. You know, if you couldn't run a marathon in 3 hours, you didn't bother. And everyone was lean. Now what happened in 1976, running became very popular and everyone started doing it. And now if you go to the average, so 1976, we start promoting this high carbohydrate diet incorrectly. We see the harm now because if you go to any marathon, any cycling race, and you watch the people finishing over 3.5, 4 hours, they're all fat. And I apologize to have to say it, they're all fat, or not all, but the majority are. And they think that running this marathon in 5 hours is fantastic. I ran the marathon, but you're obese, and that's killing you. Every day that your body is just wearing out. And so only we could get to those people and say, listen, your diet is wrong. And if you eat a high-fat diet, you'll lose all that weight and you will run faster because you're not carrying all that extra 20 kilograms that you don't need. So that's a message that we just desperately need to get out. And just by the way, I'm currently doing research with some guys in Pennsylvania And we started looking at comparing high carbohydrate to high fat diets in better than average athletes. These guys can run 5Ks in 20 minutes, which means they can run 4 minutes a kilometer, which is a good speed. And it's better than 88% of all North American runners. So there are still 12% of runners who are better than the guys we studied, but there's 88% who are the same or worse. And we found diet made no difference to their performance, no difference whatsoever. We've done another study, which we're currently writing up, where they raced over 1 mile. No difference in performance, except that the guys on the high-fat diet lost more weight. So they were 2 kilograms lighter. And that's the key. If you're eating a high-carbohydrate diet, doesn't matter how much you're running, you're carrying an extra kilo or 2 in your gut, which you can't see, but if you come to us, we'll show you it's there. And the only way you can lose that 1 to 2 kilograms is not by running another 100 miles a week. It's not going to work. You have to change your diet, get your insulin down. Once you get your insulin down, then you're okay. It's really interesting. In retrospect, the reason I loved running the comrades was I would go and train, and we'd run 40 miles in training. And after about 4 hours, I'd get this lift. And that was because now I was kind of getting rid of all that carbohydrate junk I was eating. I was now turning over to fat metabolism, which my body was designed to do and was very efficient doing. But it took me 4 hours of running. So I only ever got there when I was running ultra marathons. And that's when I felt amazing. Now I realized if I hadn't been eating all that carbs, I could have done it much easier.
Now, Professor, one of the last questions before we start wrapping up is, I think one of the big, there's always the big questions of life. People ask, what's the meaning of life? People ask all these different things. But one of the big questions that's always been plaguing humanity is the dynamics of weight and the dynamics of getting a healthy body weight, specifically now in modern times. I don't think our ancestors worried too much about it, but I think one of the modern conundrums is definitely the basics of weight loss and getting to a healthy weight. Even if you repeat something that you've said already on this episode, what are the basics, the real, like, anyone can understand it, basics of getting to a healthy weight?
Okay, if you have to worry about your weight, your diet's wrong. That's as simple as that. Let me repeat that. If you're worried about your weight, your diet's wrong. And you can go and try and change it and moderate it and eat less eat less calories. So you're going to least calories and run more. Doesn't work. You have to find the diet that makes you not hungry. That's the key. So since I converted 12 years ago, I've never been hungry again. For 12 years, I used to be looking for food all the time. And I'd walk into the supermarket and then your mouth starts drooling when you see all this food. I walk through there now and it has no impact on me. I get stopped. The thing that I get stopped most by women in the road is that they come and they embrace me and they say, Professor Noakes, you took away my food cravings. Thank you very much. That's the key. If you had food cravings, you're going to have a weight problem all your life. You've got to get rid of the food cravings. That's the key. So you must be able to eat maximum twice a day, maximum. One big meal and one sort of top up smaller meal. That's how humans should be eating. The idea that you should be eating 6 meals a day is rubbish. The idea that you should be eating 3 meals a day is nonsense. You just need to eat infrequently, and that's really the key. So that's my argument. You've got to find the foods that you can eat infrequently. Your body is in good shape when you can fast for 24 hours and not worry. When you can say, if I don't eat for the next 24 hours, it's fine. Then you're getting metabolically in good state.
Right. And maybe to give a little bit of a direction pointer for the audience, what are some suggestions of types of food that do satiate your hunger and that takes away a lot, or it gets a lot of these food cravings under control?
Yeah. Well, they're real foods. They're not processed food. If you're eating processed foods, they're full of sugar, and the sugar is what's driving your hunger. You need a lot of fat and you need a lot of protein, and that's what takes away your hunger. And whereas carbohydrates stimulate hunger. So every time you eat carbs, you're going to be made more hungry. So, I mean, we wrote the book, The Real Meal Revolution, and there's a table. The brilliance of that book is the green list at the back, All you do is you photocopy that green list. I don't mind if you don't buy the book, just buy the green, just look at the green list and stick it up on your fridge. And those are the foods you can eat. And they're all real foods. None of them are processed. And then more recently, we wrote a much simpler book, The Eat Right Revolution. And I think this has got some simple diets at the back and the foods. And in fact, yeah, it has a green list in it as well. So this was a simple book that we wrote to explain the whole story. And but that's it. You've got to eat real foods, not processed foods. So when you go to the supermarket, you just go and look at the meat and the fish and the dairy and the vegetables. And you ignore all the center aisles, which are full of grains and so on, which you don't want those grains and sweets and that rubbish.
And then I'm also going to, I'm just waiting for StreamYard to not freeze, but I'm going to put that green list on the screen. I'm just, there we go. Just going to present that on the screen. Here we go. All right. So there you go. There's that green list. It's from Professor Noakes' website. So you can see there, I'm not going to read all of it, but you can see there, you can pause the video and you can go read for yourself. I'm going to slowly go down. So if you also want to see the rest down the bottom, and this can be found if you just Google green list Professor Noakes, you'll find it as well. But there it is on the screen for those that are interested. All right. Well, Professor, thank you very much. This has been an enlightening conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and the audience seems to have enjoyed it very much as well. There's a lot of your fans in my audience that I can clearly see here today listening. I see here Cameron asked for a link. I will do so in just one moment. I'll put it in in the chat. I'm just going to post it here. There you go. There's the link. Professor, thank you very much. And I'm going to ask you the final question, and that is, excuse the pun, but if there's something that you can give the audience to chew on for the next week, maybe to keep at the back of their mind, just an idea or a thought, or maybe even a rhetorical question that you'd like to leave them with, this is your opportunity now.
Yeah, enjoy your life, and I think look after your health. That's really important. You know, I'm now at the age of 72. I'm about to turn 73 in a month's time, and I shouldn't be on this earth. I should be dead, because I should have had diabetes for 12 years, and had I had the diabetes for 12 years, I'd be dead. And don't wait till you're 60 to discover what food you should be eating, because by then it may be too late. So please understand that the most important determinant of your long-term health is what you're eating, is what you put in your mouth every single day. And every morsel that you eat, you got to consider, is this actually helping me, or is this entertainment food? And don't choose the entertainment food, and choose the nutrient-dense foods. And then you'll get to 100, hopefully, and you'll have a fantastic life. But the point is, you won't be debilitated by 60 and worn out by 70. That's what you don't want. That you want to be alert and alive and physically active, and your brain's still working in your 80s and 90s, and it can be achieved. And the only people who aren't achieving it are the ones who have eaten the wrong diet for too long.
Well, Professor, thank you very much. And I think we'll probably see you doing these types of interviews when you're 100 and over still. Hopefully that there's still many years of educating people on nutrition. Before we say goodbye, I also just wanted to use this opportunity to thank again the sponsor of today's episode, Bitvice, where if you're interested in getting into crypto or buying crypto, you can go to their website. There's a link in the description. They help you, and they sell Bitcoin directly to your self-custody, meaning that unlike a traditional crypto exchange, you don't have to trust anyone to hold your Bitcoin for you. So you can go check it out, even if you just have questions. And you can also check out their podcast called By the Horns, which is available on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Very interesting stuff. Now, I also just want to thank everyone that tuned in today, everyone in the chat with all your questions and your comments. It was very enlightening and it was very interesting. And then lastly, I just want to direct everyone to the description of the video, where you will find links to Professor Noakes on Twitter. You'll find a link to the Noakes Foundation website that has all the information and more that you need. And then also there's a link there that you'll see next to more about Professor Noakes if you want to go read that very long CV that we didn't have time to cover in this episode. It's all there. So all the links after the show, if you still want to now start digging into some of the insights that the Noakes Foundation has to share, all those links are in the description. There's a lot of reading you can do that'll keep you busy for quite a while, and I hope you enjoy it. And then Professor Noakes, just before we go, just give the titles of your books again if people are interested in getting their hands on them.
Yeah, so the books are The Real Meal Revolution. That was the original book, which explains why we promote this diet and the evidence behind it. Then I went on trial and for promoting that diet, and this is the story of that trial, The Law of Nutrition, which I wrote with Marika Sporos, a journalist. Those are two of the important books. And then The Eat Right Revolution is the third one. And then many people, where I got it wrong, was The Law of Running. So this is the great book that tells you how to train for running, but it tells you to eat too much carbohydrate. So literally in a week, I'm starting the revision, the 5th revision of this book. So it's going to be a lot of change. Saying,
is it going to get even thicker?
No, I think they've said, listen, you can't add any more. You got to subtract. So I'm going to subtract the bad stuff and keep the good stuff.
All right. But Professor, thank you very much for all your insights. Now, my audience, you know where to go find them. You know where to get more information. I do think there's still a long journey ahead of many of you in your getting to know your nutrition and what to do with your health. But thank you very much for everyone that tuned in. Professor, I hope you have an excellent day ahead and an excellent week, and all the best to you, and good luck there on the front lines fighting for people's health and to get the truth out there for people.
Thank you, Ernst. And what I didn't show you was my jersey, because this is from my son-in-law who coaches this team. So we're hoping this team does well on Saturday. So hold thumbs for the Stormers.
Well, I'm from the Western Cape. I'm from the Western Cape, born and bred there. So I'm on the same page as you, Professor.
Excellent.
All right.
Thank you so much. It's been a lovely interview. Thanks, Ernst. I appreciate it very much.
All right. Cheers, guys. Have a good one. And